In his letter to the Colossians, St. Paul called Luke the evangelist the beloved physician. Echoing Paul's words, Eusebius went on in the 4th century to reference Luke's legacy as a practitioner of medicine, noting that he left us in 2 inspired books, proofs of the spiritual art of healing. Later writers, including the 13th century chronicler Jacobus de Voragine, offered amplification. In his widely read Compendium of Saints' Lives, Voragine noted that St. Luke, who he described as a quote-unquote physician and a distinguished painter, quote, prescribed a very healthful medicine for us. It is, he said, of 3 kinds. The first is penance, which cures all spiritual sickness. The second, an observance of counsel, increases good health, while the third, an avoidance of sin and iniquity, is a safeguard against spiritual illness and decay. But Luke's 2 inspired books were not all that attested his capacity to heal. So too did his legendary portraits of the Madonna. To substantiate the claim, Voragine offered a testamentary example in his life of St. Gregory. Seeking to dispel the fetid air of plague that had settled on Rome, Gregory organized a penitential procession. Holding aloft a quote-unquote perfect likeness of the Virgin Mary, painted by Luke, Gregory led the repentant Romans through the warren of city streets. When, in the procession's wake, the air turned from foul to pure, it was evident to all that the sacred images Luke painted were as efficacious as the hallowed words he wrote. By the 16th century, some 90 editions of Voragine's Corpus of Saints' Lives had circulated throughout Europe the story of Luke's wondrous portrait of the Virgin, known as the Vera Icon. Concurrently, miracle-working images of the Madonna proliferated. Some were Lucan icons imported from the East. Others replicated the archetype, and still others, like the Madonna dell'Arco, acquired cultic status independently, their ability to move, speak, and effect an impressive array of extraordinary healings having been attested by the faithful and verified by ecclesiastical review. As word of mouth and a myriad of print media spread reports of miraculous recoveries and countless rescues, representations of the Madonna became focal points of votive devotion, beckoning pilgrims in search of spiritual salvation and physical well-being. Although Lucan icons were well and widely known by the 8th century, portrayals of Luke actively engaged in painting the Vera Icon began to proliferate significantly only in the 15th century, only to see that trend soon reduced. Responding to the word-oriented devotional culture of Protestantism, Catholic reformers assembled at the Council of Trent in 1563 officially called for the curbing of superstitious offenses perceived to be taking place with and around sacred images. Predictably, representations of Luke reflected the din of critical voices. Increasingly, Luke, the biblical author of God's word, was emphasized over Luke, the distinguished painter. But where, we might ask, was Luke, the beloved physician of Colossians 4:14 during this period? Arguably, the answer is that he was omnipresent, at least implicitly. Because Luke was a safeguard against sickness to all those who heeded the words he wrote, as well as to all those who venerated the portraits of the Virgin he painted, each and every representation of him, whether plying the pen or wielding the brush, tacitly referenced his capacity to heal. That said, Luke's identity as a physician was rarely foregrounded in works of art. I know of only one example: Giovanni Lanfranco's Saint Luke healing the dropsical child of around 1622, 1623. It is a work that has been identified as a votive offering commissioned by Orazio Falconieri and his wife of 7 years, Ottavia Sacchetti. Lanfranco's Luke is an expansive figure, facing forward, arms spread wide, head tilted back, eyes turned heavenward, and with his face illumined by divine light, he is at once in spiritual communion with God and in palpable contact with humanity. Focused on truths emanating from heaven, he holds the wrist of the sick child beside him with fingers carefully positioned to measure the strength and rapidity of the young patient's pulse. With his other hand, Luke distractedly steadies the Vera icon purchased upright on the table before him. In this painting, Lanfranco imparted Luke's multifaceted character in full. The intensity with which the evangelist listens to the divine directives that will help him heal the child identifies him as the conveyor of God's will and word, the scriptor who penned the third canonical gospel and recorded the Acts of the Apostles. Concomitantly, the brushes and palette he holds in his left hand make clear that he is also the pictor who painted the conspicuously displayed portrait of the Madonna. As for Luke Medicus, Lanfranco's assiduous depiction of a child rife with signs of sickness points to the beloved physician in St. Paul's letter to the Colossians. The child is not, however, singular in signaling Luke's capacity to assist the unwell. The volume of Hippocratic writings lying so conspicuously on the table indicates his familiarity with learned medical texts. In fact, the book does more than allude to Luke's vocation as a doctor. In concert with other pictorial elements, it can be seen to represent one of several remedial options in a 17th century quest for well-being. The painting of the Madonna, with which it is so purposefully aligned, proffers another option in this quest. In early modern Italy, individuals confronted by the inevitable reality of disease faced an array of different services to deal with the many and varied effects of what contemporaneous texts generally referred to as an infirmity. Physicians and apothecaries offered the sick and enfeebled therapies founded on observations and practices recorded in learned texts. Folk healers tendered remedies rooted in popular wisdom that had been passed from one generation to the next, while the Roman Catholic Church presented holy relics and sacred images to the frail and afflicted. In 1998, David Gentlecore mapped these options, medical, popular, and ecclesiastical, as three interlocked and overlapping circles, making it clear that seeking aid in one sphere of care did not preclude efforts to procure it in another. And the votive waxes hanging in the St. Margaret are on the shelves of the apothecary below. So you can see that one source. There is plenty of evidence to justify Gentlecore's claim. For example, in the Miracle Book of the Neapolitan Shrine of the Madonna dell'Arco, which is dated 1608, an entry notes that one Francesco Cola di Ruzzo was treated at the Ospedale degli Incurabili before seeking curative intervention from the Madonna. Similarly, we read in the Miracle Book compiled between 1619 and 1625 for Viterbo's sanctuary of the Madonna della Quercia that on or about March 8 in 1510, one Bartolomeo de Silvestro got into a violent argument with two co-workers. Having received deadly wounds, he was left for dead by his assailants. Yet somehow Bartolomeo had the wits to call upon the Madonna della Quercia. Hearing his plea for help, she appeared to him as a woman dressed in white. According to the Miracle Book narrative, which is documented as having been based on the inscription actually attached to a modest votive figure fashioned of wax and wood within the sanctuary, this woman dressed in white helped Bartolomeo to his feet, told him to maintain his faith in her, then promised to restore his health. Although reassured, Bartolomeo clearly decided to hedge his bets. Following the Madonna's departure, he went straight, quote, to the surgeon in Tolfa, where he was quickly looked after. It was the next day that he found himself safe and sound, and then came to give thanks to the Madonna della Quercia. I propose that with its prominent juxtaposition of sacred image and venerable medical text, Lanfranco's St. Luke healing the dropsical child can be viewed as a visual variant of these and similar miracle book passages. Moreover, I suggest that Lanfranco's painting is not singular in its visualization of remedial options. To demonstrate my point, I turn to a distinctive group of 17 popularly donated votive panel paintings, or tavolette votive, in the Neapolitan sanctuary of the Madonna dell'Arco. And this is actually not dell'Arco. This is the della Quercia, but I want to get you oriented to the size, which you can at the exhibition. In general, tavolette are small in size, rudimentary in style, and at the time Lanfranco painted his St. Luke, were produced principally in workshops by unnamed artists for an open market. These humble offerings can be roughly divided into two groups. One comprises pictures of imminent life-threatening danger, a fall into a well or down the stairs, a house engulfed in flames, a pregnant woman thrown from a horse, etc. The other group reference an illness or condition of infirmity. Despite an economy of means and an obvious reliance on convention, paintings in the first group, that is this one, communicate clearly their raison d'etre. Rarely can the same be said about the second group, this group. Whether or not this reflects the difficulty of depicting, say, a fever, as opposed to a man attacked by a wolf, the fact is that a tavoletta offered by a supplicant, whether he was soliciting divine assistance or acknowledging its receipt, rarely goes beyond equating what was generally termed infirmity with being bedbound. There are, to be sure, some striking exceptions to the rule, such as a scene in which a woman bears her cancerous breasts to surgeons, and another in which a man is shown with his ulcerated leg propped up on a chair. But far more typically, the afflicted is simply pictured sitting or lying in bed, oftentimes with hands clasped in prayerful petition. Lacking an elucidating inscription, which most do not have, a viewer cannot know either the cause or course of the disease. Even a prognosis cannot be surmised unless, as seen here, a priest is pictured administering last rites. The group of 17 panels in the Madonna dell'Arco collection, which it is worth noting comprise only 5% of those referencing some sort of illness, are different, in striking contrast to the hundreds of tavolette that depict the infirm asymptomatically. In this group, a less than pleasant symptom is represented in all of its horrifying disgust. Here, to quote an entry in the sanctuary's miracle book, the votary is shown, quote, infirm, with a great and highly dangerous flux of blood issuing from the mouth, end quote. Sorry, it's in the morning, I know. Another distinctive aspect of this group is the notable bedside presence of doctors. It is a presence that runs counter to a message that is repeated with regularity, not only in the miracle book of this and other healing shrines, but one that is reiterated on votive plaques and even on protracted tavolette inscriptions. Despaired and abandoned by doctors, the gravely ill turn to God. Through his community of saints, he succeeds where those trained with medical knowledge faltered and failed. Given the votive context in which these statements were asserted, it is not at all surprising that prayer should emerge as the most efficacious of medicaments. But this raises the question, why bother to include physicians at all? As I hope to show, the answer is found when the medical presence is viewed in conjunction with the depicted symptom. So to begin, when pilgrims wandering through the vast space of the sanctuary of the Madonna dell'Arco in the first decades of the 17th century looked at these tavolette, what did they see? What did this vomiting or coughing up of blood signify? Although earlier in date, the necrology of the Venetian convent of Corpus Domini that was compiled by Sister Bartolomeo Riccoboni between 1395 and 1436 suggests a possible answer. Sister Bartolomea's necrology does two things. One, it describes the piety of the nearly 50 women who died within the convent's walls in those years. Two, it details to varying degrees the final days of each of the sisters' lives before they joined Christ in heaven. In several cases, Sister Bartolomea described a nun as having spent her final days vomiting, quote unquote, globs of blood with, quote, horrendous agony and without any remedy and with such tremors and fainting that it was a pity to see her, end quote. Had Sister Bartolomea been among those looking at these tavolette, she would have understood by experienced observation that an expectoration of this kind means only one thing: death is imminent. But Sister Bartolomea's conclusion was countered by another. Since antiquity, acute diseases were held to have a crisis or turning point, which usually took the form of a sudden excretion of bad humors. Galen had argued the point in two treatises on crisis and on critical days. His ideas were subsequently taken up by Muslim medical authors, then developed further by Latin scholastic medicine. The long practiced procedure of bleeding a patient was a medical attempt to trigger just such a crisis or turning point. In the absence of medical intervention, a heavy sweat during a fever, a bout of vomiting, or an attack of diarrhea were all understood to be a physical manifestation of a crisis. And far from being feared as a sign of impending death, these dramatic expurgations signaled the beginning of the process of recovery. Here, then, we see the critical crisis point, a miraculous transition from one state of being to another, a transition from sickness to health. Put simply, these tavolette visualize a miracle, and they do so with the same degree of dramatic verve seen in depictions of wolf attacks and falls from rooftops and tumbles downstairs. But did the people who purchased these tavolette in the market understand expurgation in light of Galenic medicine? In all likelihood, they did. In recent years, historians have shown that by the 17th century, Galenism had found its way into all strata of society. Learned precepts established by the elite medical school of Salerno, for example, had by this time been transformed into popular proverbs. An apple a day keeps that kind of thing. Additionally, a wide range of popularizing medical books, health manuals, and collections of medicinal recipes were in wide circulation. Admittedly, the material covered in popularly published sources varied. Some recorded magical remedies, others the medieval Salernitan tradition. Regardless, all illness narratives reveal a populace that assumed responsibility for its own well-being. Above all, this included choosing a curative course of action among available remedial options. As stated earlier, miracle books make it quite clear that selecting one option did not preclude taking advantage of another. I remind you that Bartolomeo de Silvestro visited a surgeon before fulfilling his vow to the Madonna della Quercia, and that Francesco Cola di Ruzzo sought hospital treatment before turning to the Madonna dell'Arco. And so it might seem here, except for the fact that of the 10 doctors depicted in this distinctive group of tavolette, only one actively, that is doctor, applies his skill dislodging some obstruction from the patient's mouth. Typically, when doctors are represented on votive panels, they are depicted performing the surgical procedures ascribed to barber surgeons, like the woman with the cancerous breast, but not here. Why? There are, I think, a couple of possible answers. One relates these images to Lanfranco's St. Luke, or to be more specific, the inclusion of a volume of Hippocrates on the table. Closed, the book signals perhaps the ineffectuality of human intervention compared to the divine. The Hippocratic volume can also be related to the long advocated integration of ecclesiastical and medical spheres that was mandated by papal bull in 1566. Although compliance may have been minimal, medical practitioners were informed that henceforth they would have to ensure that the sick had made confession before they began treatment. That may be what we see here. Perhaps more to the point, at this juncture and in conclusion to this talk, we can view this group of tavolette as visually amplifying the inextricability of body and soul, advanced by directive and embraced by medical ethicists such as Battista Codronchi. If confession cleansed the soul by the purging of sin, expectorating blood, whether by administered purgation or of itself, the body could be released from disease. After all, health was semantically related to salvation, at least etymologically so. Thus, in a votive context, this could be perceived as not one miracle, but two. Through purgation, bloodletting, vomiting, whatever, health is restored to the physical body. It is a miraculous recovery worthy of thanks for grace received. And through a purgation of all spiritual sickness, which is one of the 3 types of healing prescribed to us by St. Luke, the door for passage into the world of salvation is opened. And this too is a miracle deserving of thanks. And I just leave you with an example, and there are many of this ongoing tradition.